somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, like
And it was
we should have
close.
just ran box 2 on that.
It was close. It's just Boca couldn't get the dribble in. And
Yeah,
then she got
and
fouled.
you could see it. Like she couldn't get it up because the ball freaking. She was fouled.
And then you see some ones they call us for us. Like, what's it called? That kid ran into Brogan after he got a foul.
Good morning, Toka. Big Brother is watching. And listening. Yeah. Okay, it looks like everybody's more or less there and ready to go to work. Seems to me we were last talking about the general subject of slavery in America and how America was dealing with it. Let's look at it again a little bit. And we'll move on as we work our way into the Civil War, which is, of course, pretty much all about the topic of slavery. So we'll be using the PowerPoints. We'll start out anyway using the where is it? Hello? The second culture, politics, and antebellum period that we just started on Monday. And we're going to switch over to something called the approach to Civil War. And I'll go back and look and make sure that you have that. We talked about reform a little bit. We talked about slavery. I showed you the hideous picture of Peter, the slave. Yes, ma'am? Can't see. Put your glasses on.
They are.
Oh, okay. I thought we were getting into Amazing Grace there.
And it is a good song.
It's overused. I talked about the fact that the slaves did fight back, did respond to slavery, weren't in a very advantageous position to do it. We talked about 4 conspiracies I'd like you to remember: Gabriel's conspiracy, the New Orleans Rebellion, otherwise known as the German Coast Rebellion, because that's the general area. It's an area down in Louisiana along the Gulf Coast. Denmark Vesey's conspiracy was a little different because it was started by a freed black man who wanted to free slaves. And finally, Nat Turner's Rebellion, which turned pretty nasty. A lot of people were killed in that. All of them were nasty in as much as there was retribution for the slaves. Death was probably the easiest of the retributions. It was pretty nasty. You're going to see a general shift in attitudes of Americans through this period. Down in the South, people are becoming fearful of slave uprisings, as well they should have been. If you look in the written notes that I gave you, one set called Slavery and Conflict, I list a whole bunch of people that I don't have time to talk about, people who were working to abolish slavery in the later years, in the 1800s. And I also list a few people that wanted to preserve slavery. We'll talk about kind of a general drift. As we go through these slides in the PowerPoint, we'll talk about kind of a general drift away from the idea. A lot of people had the idea of gradual emancipation of slavery for several reasons. They were afraid of civil disorder, so they thought maybe if we gradually approached that emancipation of slavery, freeing slaves gradually, that somehow they could be assimilated into society in a peaceful way. But a lot of people in the South knew that slaves would be extremely resentful and really feared having them at their liberty. And a lot of people in the North were losing patience with the South and starting to argue for instant abolition of slavery instead of doing it gradually some way. I don't know if we talked about the attitudes of our early founding fathers last time. We talked a little bit about Franklin and Jefferson and Jay. They were all, and Thomas Paine, they were all in favor of the abolition of slavery, and yet, for one reason or another, most of them had slaves. I think Benjamin Franklin had a manservant who was technically a slave. And then the later leaders like James Madison, James Monroe, Henry Clay, John Marshall, Daniel Webster, all supported something called the American Colonization Society. And strangely enough, this idea was they bought a piece of land over on the western side of Africa, and they were going to ship freed slaves back there. Strangely enough, a lot of people who were humanitarian supported this, but a lot of people who were not, a lot of people who wanted to support slavery still wanted to ship freed slaves back to Africa. Their reasoning was different. Their reasoning was they didn't want freed people of African origin causing the slaves to become more dangerous. So there were kind of two groups of people that supported this American Colonization Society. That's it on the map. Of course, eventually what you see is the founding of a country called Liberia. And because it was an artificial country, and because people from all over Africa ended up being put there, just dropped on the shore there, there was internal strife amongst different ethnic groups of Africans. You have to continually remember that there were many, many African ethnic groups. And a lot of them were permanently built into their psyches. They were Lozi people, or they were Matabele people, or whatever. They didn't like each other. And the local people, where Liberia was founded, didn't want all these new people coming either. And from that day until this day, there has been bloody strife in Liberia. And next door to Liberia is the country of Sierra Leone, and that's where the British started dropping slaves off. If they freed them by capturing a slave ship, or some of the slaves that they'd freed in the United States during the American Revolution ended up going to Sierra Leone, same problem. In fact, their national language is kind of almost English. You could call it pidgin. And if you're very patient and think about what's being said, you can actually understand most of it, or a lot of it. I happened during my career to be assigned to go over to Sierra Leone, but it was so volatile there that it all fell apart, and we had to take our people out. And it's not much better now. That's what happens when human beings try and play social games. I think I may have said we're going to start talking about the Beecher family. Just one of many families. Lyman Beecher was a preacher. Henry Ward Beecher was a preacher. He was his son. Catherine was his elder daughter. She believed in women's rights, but she thought women still belonged in the home and not out doing other things. She disagreed with a lot of her other women's rights campaigners. Henry Ward Beecher is going to get involved with the Kansas issue a little bit later on. Harriet Beecher Stowe, you should recognize her name because she wrote one of the most widely published books in English language history. In fact, at the time it was published, there were probably the only other book that was published more widely was the Bible. Harriet Beecher Stowe was the woman who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. A work of fiction, but a work to paint a picture of the evils of slavery in the South. There were the Grimke sisters, kind of famous. Sarah Moore Grimke, Angela and Emily Grimke. They were born on a plantation. When they were little children, they played with the children of the slaves. It was a kind of a cold slap in the face with a wet rag when they realized that their childhood friends grew up to be slaves, sometimes working in the fields. They also believed in women's rights, and they just really didn't fit in to plantation life. So eventually, when both of them are old enough, they're going to leave, and they're going to go up to Philadelphia. They're going to leave all their family behind and go. Then there are people like Theodore Weld, who was a writer, editor, speaker, organizer. He wrote, it's not an essay, it's more of a collection of essays called American Slavery as It Is, strongly against slavery. And probably the biggest name, and as I said, in your written notes, you've got a whole list of interesting people, black and white, who opposed slavery and took action against slavery, and also, in many cases, supported women's rights and other things. William Lloyd Garrison was an abolitionist, and somewhere at the beginning of the 1830s, maybe 1829 or something, he realized that all this la-di-da talk about slowly but surely we'll free all the slaves wasn't working. And he decided it was an evil thought because it was a way of putting the problem off over and over again, so slavery didn't go away. And he called this gradualism. He called it the popular but pernicious doctrine of gradual emancipation. He wanted the slaves to be freed right now. Maybe a judge or somebody in the Supreme Court, you're free, that's the end of slavery. He also, as time went by, and he did a lot of writing, he published a paper called The Liberator. He supported a lot of people. He supported for a while, or he got along, collaborated with former slave Frederick Douglass, probably one of the most eloquent abolitionist voices. But gradually, as he examined the situation in the mid-1830s, he's thinking, one of the reasons we still have slavery is our Constitution. And he felt because some Southern people were using the Constitution, such as the 14th Amendment, not the 14th Amendment, didn't exist yet, the 4th Amendment, to support slavery because it protected private property. And so he became very, very vehemently opposed to the American United States Constitution. And that causes a little bit of a split because there are societies that have been formed, the New England Anti-Slavery Society that he formed, and then later on he cooperated just a few years later with the American Anti-Slavery Society. He cooperated with two gents from New York, Arthur and Lewis Tappan, to form that society, but they came apart over this issue of the United States Constitution. And his cooperation with Frederick Douglass, the former slave, also came apart over the issue of the Constitution, which weakened the abolition movement somewhat. But make no bones about it, the abolition movement will succeed eventually. All the people on this slide that's up here now are people of African origin, Americans one and all, who one way or another influenced the fight against slavery. Two of them, William Wells Brown and Henry Walton Bibb, were authors. They weren't poor people. The two ladies became involved in things like the Underground Railway, the way of smuggling slaves out of the South. The man in the middle, Frederick Douglass, became an eloquent spokesman against slavery, traveled over to Europe and spoke against slavery as well as in the United States. And in later years, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, that was the name they called her. Her name was, I always get her name wrong. Where is it? Isabella Baumfree was her actual name. She took the name of one of her owners. Harriet Tubman will soon be on a, what, $10 bill? The word is that they're going to start putting her face on the $10 bill. And she, one way or another, in the Underground Railroad, she probably only saved something just under 100 people, but in her cooperation with the American government, during the early years of the Civil War, you could run her total of saved slaves up to about over 300. She cooperated with the Navy when they were doing raids along the coast of the Carolinas, helped persuade slaves, get on these ships and let's get out of here. They were afraid of those ships. They didn't know what was going on. There's Sojourner Truth. I think I mentioned her when I was talking about women's rights. And that's the kind of the symbol that was taken from her and from her speech. Am I not a woman and a sister? That was because of the split in the women's rights movement. Some of the women who were fighting for women's rights were Southern women who didn't think that black people should be involved in this fight. The two newspapers, the biggest newspapers, anti-slavery newspapers, one was published by William Lloyd Garrison that we mentioned before, one was published by Frederick Douglass. After they split apart, you notice the name of Frederick Douglass's paper. I don't know if you can see it clearly or not. But it's called the North Star, and of course the North Star is significant for escaping slaves because they traveled by night. Even the ones that were cooperating with the Underground Railroad would travel by night and hide somewhere by daytime until they got out of the slave states. And they used the North Star to navigate. It was one star that almost everybody could find. There are other arguments against slavery. One was a Southerner. He didn't like slavery, but his argument was an economic argument. And he said that slavery and cotton are going to ruin the South. We have to diversify. We have to stop relying on slave labor, or we're going to go down the drain. Boy, was he right. His name was Hinton Helfer. He was like a lonely voice echoing in the darkness in the South. But there are other people that agreed with him. Then there's the other side of the argument. Pro-slavery people. Of course, John C. Calhoun argued that slavery was a matter of property and no one had the right to take property away. Then you had James Henry Hammond. I think I've got a picture of him. There's a picture of him. He was a senator from North Carolina. He was one of the guys that advocated the gag rule. You see, in the House of Representatives and the Senate both, anti-slave people would get up and start speeches about abolishing slavery. And it got to be a daily thing. And so they came up with this idea, let's have a rule, the Senate and the House, they have a committee, each have a committee called the Rules Committee, and they set up how they function internally. And they made a gag rule to shut these people up. Interestingly, John Quincy Adams broke the gag rule. He was one that made them vote against the gag rule when they took it away. But Henry Hammond, or James Henry Hammond, look at the quote from him. Fanatics! That's what all abolitionists were as far as he was concerned. Can be silenced in but one way. Terror. Death. This is a senator in the United States Senate saying something like that. Then there was William Yancey. Later on, when the Civil War breaks out, he'll be a senator in the Confederate States of America. He's against a lot of different things that we'll talk about in the near future, the Wilmot Proviso, popular sovereignty. And he's the author of the Democratic Platform in Alabama, which was designed to preserve slavery. William Joseph Harper was another senator from South Carolina. He wrote a memoir on slavery, saying that slavery was a good thing because it achieved social balance. And he said that countries that don't have slavery aren't balanced. Only in the slave-holding southern United States, Brazil, and Cuba were people making social progress. Go figure. This is supposed to be a man with a brain. George Fitzhugh just hated black people in general. He wrote that the Negro is but a grown-up child who needs the economic and social protections of slavery. He wrote in 1849 a book called Slavery Justified. 1857 he wrote another book, totally racist book called Cannibals All, or Slaves Without Masters, arguing against having freed people of African origin in our country. Thomas Dew, he should have really known better. He was the president of William and Mary College, now William and Mary University. When Virginia almost voted during 1831 and 1832 to abolish slavery in the state, he was one of the people that organized resistance to that vote so that the vote failed. So there's a special place and a hot place somewhere, if you want to believe in that sort of thing, where he is to this day. He's the co-author of a manifesto called the Pro-Slavery Argument. Then there was this guy who would almost be funny if it wasn't the fact that he was a doctor who should be educated, and he used his medical degree to describe slaves' desire to be free was a disease. And he goes into deep pseudo-scientific explanations of why only a diseased slave mind would want to be free, and how to cure it. You could go on and on with these people. Let's talk about the election of 18. Oh, we talked about 44. We don't need to talk about the Mexican-American War. Let's shift over. Okay, we're going to start talking about what I call the 10 steps to the Civil War. And I want you to remember these 10 steps for what they are. In a way, it's an oversimplification. But it kind of gets to the heart of us getting into the Civil War. The Civil War was coming. We put it off a couple of times. But it was inevitable. The first step on my little list is called the Wilmot Proviso. It happened during the Mexican-American War, 1846. David Wilmot of Pennsylvania, a senator, proposed that all the land that we got from Mexico would be free of slaves. I guess he excluded Texas. That was his idea. Now, he was a senator, but a bill like this was going to have to go through the Senate and the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives passed it. But of course, the Senate could never pass it because they were evenly balanced. And for one reason or another, you could never get a bill passed that got rid of slavery in the Senate. Finally, the president at the time was President Polk, and before he left office, he asked David Wilmot, please remove this bill from the table so we can do other business. And Wilmot, under pressure from the president, did remove the bill from the table. But other people like John Quincy Adams carried right on arguing for this. The Wilmot Proviso. Step one, a proposal that all of the new territory we gained be slave-free. Around that same time, a fairly influential senator from Michigan named Lewis Cass, he'd served as the Secretary of War under Jackson, had held other offices. He came up with another idea for solving the problem. Let's keep the federal government's nose out of it, he said. Let's let the people of each state and each territory make up their own mind whether or not they have slavery. And he called this idea popular sovereignty. And you're going to hear about it over and over again because there will be a whole bunch of people that support popular sovereignty. there's the Alabama platform. You can read it if you want. The bottom line on the Alabama platform in 1848 for the election was that no Democrat would support anybody that liked popular sovereignty, and no Democrat would support anybody that liked the abolition of slavery. So when you get to that election, you've got one group of people supporting the Wilmot Proviso. You've got one group of people supporting popular sovereignty. You've got another group of people supporting things like the Alabama platform. The Alabama platform will be discarded really quickly in the Democratic convention. It was ugly. But it'll be the Democrats, the Northern Democrats supported the Wilmot Proviso, at least, versus the Whigs, who tended to support popular sovereignty, against the Free Soil Party, and they were hardline against slavery. Zachary Taylor, the hero from the War of 1812, also a hero from the Black Hawk War and the Mexican-American War. They called him Old Rough and Ready, and he was kind of old and beat up. Wasn't nearly as old as me. Probably wasn't as beat up as me either. But he's gonna win this election. He's gonna run against Lewis Cass, the proponent of popular sovereignty, and also against Martin Van Buren, who gets the nomination from the Free Soil Party. The results are pretty clear. Zach Taylor's going to win with 163 electoral votes. He doesn't win by that much, but he gets more than half of the available votes, and that's all he needed. This isn't talking about popular votes, it's electoral votes. There he is, the 12th President of the United States. Problem is, his health isn't all that good. And we're going to lose another president before his term of office is over with. While he's president, he's going to get a treaty with Britain called the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. Remember that one? I'll show you something funny about it later on, maybe. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, we were worried. Remember I told you that even though we decided to play nice with the British, we weren't friends with the British. And we were suspicious of the British, especially in North America. The British were very interested in places like Mexico. They were very interested in the Caribbean. They were very interested in things out in the Pacific Ocean, like a group of islands called the Sandwich Islands. Anybody know what they're called now? Think frangipani trees and girls in grass skirts and things like that. Hawaii. And if you wanted to get to Hawaii fast, it would be nice to have a gateway right through the American continent to get there. Otherwise, you had to go around the southern end of South America. And so we were thinking about digging a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, and so were the British. And the idea was whoever could control that would control access to places like Hawaii. We didn't want the British to do it, and the British didn't want us to do it. So we finally made a deal with them. We won't do it if you don't do it. And if we do it, we'll do it together with you. And we'll always allow you to have the other side. Whoever digs it has to allow the other side to have free access. He also prevented Americans who were trying to get the American government sucked into doing things about Cuba. They wanted to annex Cuba and make it another southern state, a slave state, by the way. Zach Taylor wasn't much of a politician. He didn't really think that a president should go around vetoing things that Congress passed. He did support a few things like a national bank. And he did want California and New Mexico to form territorial governments and get into the Union quickly. But he died in July of 1850, so he only served a little bit more than 1 year. He had gastroenteritis, which is just a stomach bug. And the doctors probably cured him, or probably killed him by trying to cure him, because the old medicine back then was still pretty bad. They were bleeding him, giving him ipecac, calomel, opium, quinine, all sorts of things. I think it probably killed him. He will be replaced by this guy. He's a New Yorker, one of the very few New Yorkers that I care to see as president. He was a very efficient man. He'd done a lot of reform in his own home state. Here's his picture. Millard Fillmore. At the end of the Mexican-American War, we were arguing about what to do with all that new territory. That's why we had the Wilmot Proviso and all of that. And people knew it was a touchy issue. John C. Calhoun knew it, Henry Clay knew it, Daniel Webster knew it. All three of those men kind of got together and tried to come up with a series of laws that would put off any kind of conflict about slavery over this new territory. And they built this big omnibus bill. That means a bill with a little bit of everything in it. And they couldn't get it through, because it had so many different details. There was always something in it that somebody didn't like. And a young senator from Illinois, he was a railroad man. His name was Stephen A. Douglas. He said, if you can't get this giant bill through, why don't we break it down into pieces and we'll pass each piece one at a time? It's a brilliant idea. Someone should tell our Congress about that right now. There's a slide on Fillmore and some of the things he did. One of the things he did, besides settling this debate about what to do with the new territory, he had to put down an insurrection in New Mexico because some of the newcomers were trying to drive the people of Hispanic origin out. So he sent soldiers there to restore peace. He got the filibuster people out of Cuba. Before he became president, he was the man that was sitting at the chairman's desk in the Senate arguing over the Compromise of 1850. He also sent a naval task force all the way to Japan because we were thinking about doing trade with China and places like that. And the Japanese were a closed country. Nobody was allowed in, nobody was allowed out. If you were Japanese and you left Japan, you were not allowed to return. Punishment of death. And they didn't like foreigners in their country, and we're going to do a little bit of gunboat diplomacy and persuade the Japanese to open up and do business with us. And in fact, while all the other major powers in the world are doing business in China, we were the first big business connection between the Western world and Japan. Fillmore didn't like slavery, but he also didn't want to cause a war or rock the boat. A little bit like Van Buren in that respect. There's Stephen A. Douglas, who comes up with the compromise. What's he going to do? Split that big bill up into 5 pieces. And they're going to pass each one of these bills. First, admit California. California had already said we want to be a free state. So admit them. And they passed that. Then they passed an act called the Texas-New Mexico Act. And they're going to give Texas something like $10 million to be a little bit more modest about the land they claimed, and to allow them to establish a territory of New Mexico so that New Mexico could eventually become a state. It took a long time. You'd never guess the one thing that they didn't mention in the Texas-New Mexico Act at all. Nobody? It didn't mention slavery. They just dodged the issue. Then they passed the Utah Act to let the people up around Salt Lake City form their own state. And then to make the Southerners happy and make them vote for the other bills, they cut a deal with them and they passed a new federal Fugitive Slave Act, which required all authorities anywhere in the country to cooperate with the returning of escaped slaves. And the slaves had no standing before the court, or the people that they claimed were slaves had no standing before the court. And the judge just, thumbs up, thumbs down. Either you go back to the South, or you're still free. And the people up north were outraged about this. And there were riots and there was violence about it in a lot of places. And there were some people going up and just fighting a black man and saying, "Oh, you're my escaped slave," when the guy was never a slave in his life. And some people got dragged into slavery that way. Plus, a lot of people who've gone through a lot of danger to escape are going to be dragged home. And you can imagine how they're treated when they go back. To make the abolitionists a little bit happier, they made it against the law to deal in slaves in Washington, D.C. They did not abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. They just made it against the law. Somebody got a question out there in Never Never Land? Or did somebody just hit their mic? I heard my own golden voice. It's terrible to listen to your own voice. So that's the compromise of 1850, and that's step number 2, moving us towards the Civil War. Yeah, it put the war off for a while. It may have delayed the war for 10 years. But the resentments that it built are going to build the resentment that's going to finally cause us to burst into war. There's Texas, and that's the land that Texas was claiming. And they're going to be paid to shrink their ambitions a little bit. One of the people that really opposed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was Representative Thaddeus Stevens. You should remember his name because he'll be one of the leaders before and after the Civil War for civil rights. Lots of cases. I have listed here different incidents where slaves or supposed slaves were being dragged back to the South. Look at that poster. Caution, colored people of Boston. Watch out. People are looking for you. This is people trying to help escaped slaves. There's Stephen A. Douglas and his compromise. He did other things too. Step number 3. There's the member of the Beecher family. Harriet Beecher Stowe, married lady. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. You know the irony of Uncle Tom's Cabin? People use the term Uncle Tom to mean a black person who cooperates too much with the white people. Uncle Tom in this book did not cooperate with the white people. He wasn't a toady of white people. He tried to help people escape. But apparently someone didn't read the book. Step number 4, we're moving right along. Our friend, Stephen A. Douglas, senator from Illinois, had the thought that he wanted to do a north and south railroad. Most of our railroads didn't run straight north and south. He wanted to go from Chicago down to either Alabama or New Orleans, something like that. To do that, he had to settle some unincorporated territory, figure out how to do that. And so he proposed that we have a new state just west of Missouri. And the state would be Kansas. And in the law, excuse me, in the law that he proposes, he's going to split a big territory that we call Kansas Territory into 2. Now we'll have Nebraska Territory, that's the northern remainder, and a smaller piece down south next to Missouri called Kansas. This law will repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and it will institute instead popular sovereignty in the state. Now we're talking about a pretty empty place, this Kansas Territory. And Trying to look at just a map of it. Can't believe I don't have a good map of it here. What is going to happen? I want you to look down at the bottom of the slide, by the way. The people in favor of this act, Franklin Pierce was the president at this time. We'll talk about him in a minute. Senator Douglas, Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, Senator John Breckinridge of Kentucky, and almost all of the southern senators. Why would they support this bill? Because they thought that they could fill Kansas Territory with pro-slavery people because it was right next door to Missouri, which was a pro-slave state. And they saw, here we go, we're going to build our slavery empire. People against it, mainly Northerners. Charles Sumner, William Seward of New York, Salmon Chase, Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri. Look at the guy at the bottom of the list that's against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Sam Houston. He thought that the Kansas-Nebraska Act would cause a war. He'd spent about half of his life trying to get Texas to be a state. He thought this would ruin everything. They're going to pass it. It's going to start a period of great strife in Kansas as Northerners tried to cram the state with anti-slave people and Southerners tried to cram the state with pro-slave people. The first thing the Southerners did was they paid off a whole bunch of ruffians in Missouri at every local bar and tavern they could find to go into the state and set up a convention and petition to become a slave state. People like the Beecher family sponsored people from the Colonization Society to go down there and populate the state with anti-slave people. Blood will flow. They call a period of time from 1854 on up to the beginning of the Civil War bloody Kansas. Look at all the constitutions. A free state constitution was written in 1855. A pro-slavery constitution was written in 1857. The Leavenworth Constitution, which was a free state constitution plus women's rights. But the president at the time wouldn't even pass it to Congress to vote on it. He put it in the trash can. The Wyandotte Constitution will be passed in 1859, a year before the Civil War. And that will eventually be accepted by Congress. In 1854, while they're arguing about this, all the abolitionists, all the anti-slave people, businessmen, whatever, are going to meet and form a new party. They're going to put all the little splinter parties together and form a party which they will call the Republican Party. Its official birth was 1854. They picked that name to pay a homage to Thomas Jefferson. It had its first convention in Jackson, Michigan. They're going to nominate John C. Fremont, the hero from the war, the questionable hero from the Mexican-American War. They'll nominate him as their candidate for president for the election of 1866. Notice there's a garble on that slide. That's step number 4 then, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas. Where do I have Beecher's Bibles in there? There's a slide that kind of got crammed together from 2 slides. What is the Beecher's Bible? Remember Henry Ward Beecher, the member of the Beecher family, the preacher? He contributed a lot of money to sending things down to Kansas Territory, and apparently a lot of the boxes that were labeled contained Bibles actually contained Sharp's rifles, which were the rifles people used back in the buffalo hunting days. So they started calling Sharp's rifles Beecher's Bibles. And I guarantee you on the final exam there'll be a question, something along the line of, how many pages are there in a Beecher's Bible? None. It's like, how many people won the election of 1824 outright? None. That is a picture, people are glorifying a fellow named John Brown. Let's talk about this. From 1854 on, border ruffians crossed into Kansas territory. 1,600 of them registered to vote, and yet they cast 6,000 ballots. Maybe that's not on the up and up. I think you can figure that out by looking at it. They tried to do it again in 1855. A group of people meet in Pawnee, then Shawnee Mission in 1855. In August of 1855, Free Soilers meet in a little town called Topeka. President Pierce at the time, and we'll talk about President Pierce again in a minute, President Pierce condemned the Free Soil group. A congressional committee said that the Free Soil Constitution that they submitted was irregular. There's going to be fighting. Pro-slave people attacked Lawrence, Kansas. They burned a hotel down, destroyed 2 printing shops. The anti-slave fanatic, John Brown, goes to a farm that employs slaves and hacks a bunch of farmers to death with army sabers, shoots a few more. They call it the Potawatomi Massacre. After that, John Brown and his sons have to make themselves scarce for a while. They will be back. In 1856, the president sends in troops to bring peace. 1857, President Buchanan accepted the Lecompton Constitution, but Congress threw it in the trash. In the election, and I don't have a slide on it, and I don't know why, but in the election, hang on, bear with me, just before you guys run out the door. In the election of 1852, a New Yorker by the name of Franklin Pierce, he's on this thing, this is about 56, from New Hampshire.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
Is going to win the presidency, and we'll start out next time talking about his presidency a little bit, and then we'll move on to the next election. Remind me of that, Franklin Pierce.
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.